Are children changing? Our book tells us that the view of children has changed from our Middle Ages until today. Pages 41 to 43 will give you more details, but I wanted to share some important information and let you make the decision. Early in the Middle Ages, all the way about to the 17th century, children were viewed as miniature adults. They were dressed like adults. They were given adult jobs. They were also given, for fun, they would play adult activities. And it wasn't until about the 15th or the 16th century you even noticed that children were dressed differently in paintings and artwork. But there was a big shift from this children as miniature adults philosophy in the 18th century with the changes in healthcare, and more children were prospering in their health. The value of a child became increasingly higher because their survival rates were higher. And so there was a shift in the mindset that children were different than adults and that they weren't just there to add to the family labor. And instead, we saw them finally viewed as small people with different needs, and the dress changed, and toys began being developed, and they weren't doing the jobs that they were required to do in the past. We have a shift back today in some ways. Through the eyes of the media, we see children again looking like miniature adults, much like in the picture that's on this slide. We have different concerns for our children these days, and we see children engaged in competitive sports at young ages. And the toys that they used to play are replaced by electronics that are more adult-like. And so are we shifting back to children as miniature adults? The second area that children are changing, and it's actually the next couple areas, are looking at historically when children are born, what do they bring to us? So the first philosophy is when children were born, they needed redemption. In the 1300s to the 1800s, religious beliefs said children were born as sinful creatures and they should be punished if they did anything that was sinful because they had to earn redemption and become good. And this basically shaped the educational practices and even continued into the 18th and 19th centuries in European and American schools, that punishment was required to redeem children's sinful behavior. But then in the 1600s, we see the English philosopher John Locke wanted to argue this notion, and he said children were not born sinful, they were not born bad. Instead, they were born as a blank slate. And what this means is that children are born with nothing, and they become a blank slate, and their experiences and their environment around them start to develop their personalities, their values, and this increased the emphasis on the importance of education. He was definitely accurate in the fact that environmental experiences play a role in a child's learning. But one area that Locke didn't look at was individual differences in children, how children are born inherently different, and that leads to their learning experiences. And also, he didn't look at children as active learners. He looked at them as always just on the receiving end of their experiences. Then we move into the philosophy that children are innocents. And this was a lot like the philosophy of children as needing redemption. But in contrast to the theory of Locke, that children are blank slates, French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau introduced that children were just born good. They were not evil, but we should build on the child's natural goodness as we educate them. He also believed that it was important to observe children, that we could be learning from them as we watch them, and that we shouldn't rush children through the stages of development. He also said each stage was important. It wasn't just a building block to the next stage, that everything that happened within that stage was valuable, and that's part of the reason why we shouldn't push children out of each stage. This continued in practice for a long time, and you'll still find schools that believe this philosophy that children will move to the next stage on their own without being pushed, and they are learning valuable experiences within each learning stage that they encounter. Basically, we have a lot of these philosophies shaping our programs in early childhood education today, and you'll have to find the philosophy that best matches your knowledge base of children. Some other ways that children have changed outside of how they're born and how they develop is their economic value. And we see that throughout history, children's value and worth has changed and basically on a seesaw. Long ago, children were considered parents' property, and still today somewhat, but the value was how much they could give back to their family, and mostly in the form of labor. And this became an economic reason why families were large, because the more children they had, the more workers they had for their family. I know my grandmother, who was born even in the early 1900s, she was in a family of about 12 children, and they lived on a farm, and they needed each other's hands to do jobs. And that has really changed, because I personally think children are so expensive today that we can't always afford to have them, and they aren't allowed to give back to the family economically like they were back in our 18th and 19th centuries. We do see, though, that child labor laws play a big part in this change, because it limits the contributions a child can make financially to their family. We do see, though, that children have a high emotional value to families these days, and sometimes we do see families that have more children in effort to work in quotation marks within the family, taking care of siblings, and also many families believe they need children, so when they are an aging adult, there'll be someone there to take care of them. We see that a lot. The next component of children as changing constantly is the philosophy from the 20th century called the competent child. And science said that children are not in need of redemption, not a blank slate, and not this innocent just member of education. The 21st century research led us to think as the children as competent in their educational process, which means they're active in their own development and learning. The more we look at how brains build, it just makes more sense that children will learn better when they are participants and not just on the receiving end of education. And this is a big shift in how children learn and how we teach them. This had a major impact on early childhood education, but it also had an impact on what products were developed for children. If you look on the computer today, or if you look on the TV, there's so many products out there that claim that you can start your child's learning process at birth. How many of you have heard the importance of playing music to the classical music or any sort of music to the baby in the womb, or even speaking to them in the womb, that it will greatly enhance their intelligence levels? We have things like Hooked on Phonics and Baby Einstein and Get Your Baby to Read programs that are constantly being sold. I know the big one I see is abcmouths.com, how you can get your preschoolers reading at age 2 and 3. This theory that children are active players in the education process has shifted our society to push children into more adult-like stages, or if you're not going to consider an adult stage, we want them to move through the stages of development more quickly. And this does have a lot of implications. One thing I see in the public school system, when I started teaching about 20 years ago, what was considered a first grade skill is now, in 2016, a kindergarten skill. We've basically taken the curriculum and keep shifting it lower and lower, so young children are experiencing things at rapidly earlier rates. usually, or in the past, kiddos would go to kindergarten and they were there to learn their letters and their numbers to 10 and their shapes. These are skills that are preschool skills at this point. And if you don't come to kindergarten knowing these skills, you're at a deficit. So this child as someone who is a competent learner is a philosophy that's definitely trending and shaping our educational system today. Is it completely correct? I don't think so. Yes, children are competent and they're active participants, but we do also see that individual differences shape their competency, and developmentally, some of the things that they may be able to learn aren't appropriate for them at this time. So this is a constant seesaw and balance that teachers will have to make using this philosophy of the competent child. The last area I want to focus on is children as citizens with rights. And we know that, historically, children didn't have a lot of rights. That's why we had so many families that had their children laboring and things. But our present day view is children need protection. They need protection from abuse. They need protection from adults. They need protection from products that aren't safe for them, foods that aren't regulated in our country. In 1989, the United Nations Convention developed a policy that went into effect on the rights of the child. And basically every country in the world has ratified this except for Somalia and the United States. And this declares for protection from physical, mental, and sexual abuse. Now you may ask, why was this not ratified by the United States? But although it was not ratified because they have not endorsed this UN convention, we know in the United States we do have laws in effect to protect a child's from abuse of any kind. Somalia, not so much. So we know that children do have rights. They're also very aware of their rights. They know they deserve rights, and that's good. We want that expectation to be there. And so our last component here, our children changing, is the image of childhood today. And our schools are constantly swinging back and forth on that seesaw. And which philosophy do you think is employed in the schools that you've been in? What have you observed? We know that children are highly valued, but they're also abused and neglected at the same time. We know that children are competent, but how much responsibility should we put in their learning at early ages? So these are the things that are going to be shaping our early childhood education programs, and these are the things that you will constantly be hearing about in one way or another.